The grand hall of Velmar Prime shimmered with an eerie, bioluminescent glow, the high-domed ceiling pulsating with the soft light of embedded coral-like formations. The air carried a faint scent of something floral yet metallic, a signature aroma of the Velmaran court. Ethan Carter, human envoy to the Zytharian Empire, stood near the refreshment table, swirling a glass of something neon blue and supposedly non-lethal to humans. "Just smile, nod, and avoid causing an interstellar incident," he muttered under his breath. The Velmaran Diplomatic Gala was the crown jewel of interspecies diplomacy, a grand event where alliances were forged and egos carefully stroked. Tonight, he represented the Terran Republic, hoping to solidify a trade agreement with the enigmatic and powerful Velmarans. Across the room, the Zytharian royal family held court. At the center stood Princess Alinea Zytharian, a vision of striking silver-blue skin, iridescent eyes like twin nebulas, and a regal poise that demanded attention. Clad in flowing garments of shimmering fabric that moved like liquid stardust, she exuded an air of playful mischief. And she was watching him. Ethan swallowed. That couldn't be good. He had already been warned. Zytharian customs were complex, steeped in tradition and symbolism that even the most seasoned diplomats often failed to grasp. One wrong gesture could mean anything from a grave insult to an accidental challenge for the throne. Then came the music. The melodic hum of sonic harps vibrated through the hall, signaling the start of the royal ritual dance of Zytharian nobility. Elegant figures moved with fluid grace, their movements an intricate tapestry of unspoken language. Ethan watched, fascinated, as the dance unfolded, a mesmerizing display of symmetry and rhythm. A chuckle. Ethan turned his head. Alinea was watching him, smirking. "Oh no," he muttered. Then, with a tilt of her head and an unmistakable glint in her gaze, she stepped forward, right toward him. Chapter 2. The Dance of Doom. The crowd parted like cosmic tides as the princess approached. Murmurs of curiosity and amusement followed in her wake. Ethan straightened, forcing an easygoing grin, though his pulse had begun hammering against his ribs like a malfunctioning warp engine. "Envoy Carter," Alinea purred, her voice carrying a faint accent, her eyes glinting with something unreadable. "Enjoying the evening?" "Oh, trying not to embarrass humanity," Ethan said lightly. "So far, so good." Alinea's lips curled in amusement. A noble goal. Then she extended a hand. Ethan hesitated. "Oh." The entire hall was watching now. He could practically feel the stares drilling into him, the quiet anticipation thick in the air. He flicked his gaze toward Ambassador Renault, his superior, who stood across the room. Frantic hand gestures indicated, "Do not accept." Ethan did not see the warning in time. With a polite chuckle and an easy shrug, he took Alinea's hand. "Well, when in Rome." The crowd gasped. Alinea's smirk deepened. Oh, she knew exactly what he had just done. Before he could react, she pulled him onto the dance floor. The music swelled, and suddenly, Ethan was following her lead through a sequence of intricate movements. A slow turn, a synchronized step, a hand pressed to hers just long enough for the bioluminescent marks on her skin to pulse in recognition. A silent click. Something had just locked into place. Alinea took a step back, regarding him with open amusement, then turned toward the crowd. The Terran envoy has honored the sacred tradition of the Zytharian courtship ritual and performed it flawlessly. A murmur rippled through the gathered nobility. Some looked intrigued. Others were outright grinning. Ethan blinked. Wait, what? Alinea's smile turned downright wicked. "Congratulations, Envoy Carter," she announced grandly. "You are now my husband." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan's brain short-circuited. His mouth opened, then closed. He turned to Ambassador Renault, whose face had gone the color of bleached paper. What? Ethan finally managed. Alinea's eyes twinkled. "Surely you knew? The dance is a binding marriage ritual among the Zytharian elite. You performed every step correctly. Thus, our union is now sealed before the Empire." Ethan wheezed. "There's gotta be a way out of this?" Alinea placed a hand to her chin, pretending to ponder. The only way to dissolve a royal marriage is through trial by combat or death." Ethan paled. Those are my options? Alinia's grin widened. Oh, don't look so horrified. I'm quite a catch. Before Ethan could properly process his impending accidental matrimony, a new voice interrupted, sharp, disapproving. The Terran is unworthy. A tall figure emerged from the crowd. Prince Kael Zytharian, Alinia's older brother and heir to the throne. Unlike Alinia, whose mischief made her likable, Kael exuded pure menace. His sharp features, rigid stance, and piercing gaze screamed, man who takes things very seriously. This is an outrage, Kael declared. A human cannot marry into the royal line. The Emperor will never approve. Ah, but Kael, Alinia cooed. It was all done in accordance with our ancient traditions. And tradition is everything, isn't it? Kael's jaw tensed. This is a mockery. Alinia merely shrugged. Mockery or not, the law is clear. Ethan Carter is now Prince Consort of Zytharian. Ethan let out a strangled sound. I feel like I should have had more say in this. The room erupted into chaos. 30 minutes later, Ethan found himself seated on a velvet throne next to Alinia, a ceremonial sash draped across his shoulders. A palace official was enthusiastically reading from the Zytharian marriage codex, outlining his new duties as royal consort. Shall henceforth share in the responsibilities of intergalactic diplomacy, partake in royal ceremonies, and provide an heir to the Zytharian throne? Ethan choked. I'm sorry, what? Alinia patted his arm, smirking. You should really listen more carefully. Ethan groaned. I am so fired. From across the chamber, Kael watched them like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. And Ethan? Ethan had the distinct feeling that the death option might come sooner than he'd like. Ethan Carter, now Prince Consort of Zytharian, slouched in an ornate chair made of what he could only assume was some kind of living metal, pulsating faintly beneath him like a massive, dormant creature. Across from him, Princess Alinia, his brand-new wife, thanks to a diplomatic blunder of legendary proportions, sat with a decidedly smug expression, enjoying a goblet of crimson liquor that definitely looked suspiciously thick. He rubbed his temples. Okay, think. How bad is this, really? On the one hand, he hadn't been executed yet. That was a plus. On the other, he was now bound by Velmaran law, which, according to the never-ending recitation from the Zytharian High Chancellor, meant his existence had suddenly become a swirling vortex of responsibilities he neither wanted nor understood. And by the power vested in the royal union, the prince consort shall henceforth be regarded as an extension of the imperial line, with full authority to engage in matters of state, diplomacy, and— Ethan shot up in his seat. Hold on. I have authority now? Alinia nodded. Of course. You are my consort. You speak with my voice, act in my stead when required. In time, you may even command fleets. Ethan blinked. That seemed like a terrible idea for everyone involved. I was a minor diplomat 3 hours ago, he said slowly, and now I can command fleets? Alinia's smirk deepened. Yes. A meteoric rise, no? Across the chamber, Prince Kael stood near the entrance, watching him with barely concealed contempt. The heir to the throne had remained unervingly silent since the ceremony, though his piercing glare promised something violent brewing beneath the surface. Ethan turned back to Alinia. And what happens if, hypothetically, I wanted to undo all this? Alinia tilted her head, considering. Well, there's the trial by combat option, but you're fragile and would be slaughtered immediately. Ethan's stomach dropped. Right. Or, she continued, there's a petition for annulment, which requires a council vote. That sounded promising. And how likely is that to pass? Alinia's smirk turned downright predatory. Not likely at all. Ethan exhaled sharply, resisting the urge to bash his head against the definitely alive chair. Fantastic. By the time Ethan was escorted to his new quarters, which were roughly the size of a small Terran city, he was thoroughly exhausted. The palace walls shimmered with a faint bioluminescence, their surfaces shifting as though responding to his presence. Alinia had assured him this was normal, that the palace was partially sentient and would adjust itself to his comfort. That, honestly, just made him more nervous. A Zytharian servant bowed deeply as Ethan entered. Your Highness, your belongings have been transported here, and your schedule for tomorrow has been prepared. My schedule? Yes. You will begin dawn rituals, followed by political briefings, military inspections, a ceremonial hunt, and… Ethan held up a hand. Yeah, we're gonna circle back to all that later. The servant hesitated, as though unsure if denying royal duties was physically possible. Finally, with another deep bow, he exited. Ethan flopped onto what he assumed was a bed. It was soft, at least. That was a win. Then, the knife came flying at his head. Reflex saved him, just barely. He rolled aside as the blade embedded itself into the shifting, organic walls, sizzling slightly as it lodged itself in place. Ethan sucked in a breath. Holy shit. A shadow moved in the far corner of the room. A cloaked figure, tall and menacing, emerged, wielding another curved blade glowing with some kind of plasma charge. Apologies, Your Highness, the assassin murmured, voice smooth and unhurried. But the Empire cannot allow an outsider to claim the throne. Ethan's eyes darted toward the nearest exit, too far. His pulse pounded. He was unarmed, alone, and very, very screwed. The assassin lunged. Then, the walls themselves came alive. A tentacle-like tendril shot out from the shimmering palace structure, coiling around the assassin's wrist, yanking him backward with inhuman force. The blade clattered to the floor. Ethan barely had time to process what the hell was happening before a second tendril struck, slamming the would-be killer hard against the wall, knocking him out cold. A moment of stunned silence. Then, a faint, amused voice drifted through the room, soft, feminine, and very much inside his head. No harm shall come to you, Prince Consort. Ethan sat up, staring at the shifting, pulsing walls of the palace. Did you just talk to me? The bioluminescent glow around the room brightened slightly, as though in response. I am the Sovereign Spire. You are bound to the royal bloodline. I will protect you. Ethan let out a slow, shaky breath. Well, that was new. By morning, Ethan was standing in the Imperial Gardens, half-heartedly poking at an alien fruit that looked suspiciously like a sentient jellyfish. Prince Kale stood opposite him, arms folded, his expression unreadable. You survived the night, Kale noted flatly. Yeah, thanks for checking, Ethan deadpanned. Kale took a slow step forward. You think this is a game, Terran? Do you understand what you've done? Oh, trust me, Ethan said dryly. I understand plenty. Kale's gaze darkened. You have put yourself in the center of an empire of wolves. You are weak, an outsider. Your presence here is a threat to our entire political structure. Ethan held his arms out. Hey, don't look at me. I didn't even know I was proposing when I did it. Kale's jaw tightened. Perhaps. But it does not matter now. You are bound by our laws, and the royal court is already choosing sides. That got Ethan's attention. Choosing sides. Kale nodded grimly. Some will accept you. Others will want you dead before you solidify your place at Alinia's side. His expression was stony. You will not last a month. Ethan swallowed hard. That's incredibly reassuring. Kale exhaled sharply. If you wish to survive, you must learn our ways. Fast. Ethan hesitated, studying Kale's expression. Was that a hint of grudging respect? Before he could respond, Kale leaned in, voice low and warning. But make no mistake, Terran. If you falter, if you bring shame upon this throne, his golden eyes flashed. I will personally end you. Ethan let out a slow breath. Fantastic. A hostile court, an assassin problem, and a suspiciously sentient palace. Marriage, as it turned out, was way more stressful than expected. Ethan Carter had been a married man for approximately 24 hours, and he was already questioning his life choices. Standing in the grand hall of ascendancy, surrounded by towering Zytharian nobles in resplendent attire, Ethan was keenly aware that most of them wanted him dead, exiled, or at the very least, humiliated beyond repair. At the head of the chamber, seated atop the towering throne of celestial dominion, sat Emperor Vadri Zytharian, ruler of the Empire and Alinia's father. He was a formidable figure, tall, broad-shouldered, his deep azure skin gleaming under the flickering bioluminescent lights. His eyes, a piercing shade of violet, were locked onto Ethan with a quiet intensity that bordered on lethal. Beside Ethan, Princess Alinea stood with regal ease, her amusement barely concealed. She was enjoying this far too much. Ethan, however, was very much not enjoying this. "The Terran stands before me," the Emperor intoned, his voice a deep rumble that echoed through the chamber. "He has performed the sacred rites. He has spoken the unspoken vow. By our law, he is bound to the royal house." A murmur rippled through the gathered nobility. Some looked intrigued. Most looked furious. Ethan cleared his throat. If I may, your majesty, I—" A sharp glare from the Emperor shut him up instantly. "You may not." Ethan shut his mouth. The Emperor leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Terran, do you comprehend what you have done?" Ethan very much did not, but saying so seemed like a terrible idea. "I am beginning to grasp the weight of it," he hedged. The Emperor studied him. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Then, to Ethan's utter confusion, the Emperor laughed. A low, rumbling sound, not quite friendly, but not outright hostile. "You are bold," the Emperor mused. "Perhaps even foolish." "Mostly the second one," Ethan muttered under his breath. Alinea elbowed him in the ribs. The Emperor's gaze flicked to his daughter, something unreadable in his expression. "And you, Alinea, do you claim this union of your own will?" Alinea smiled sweetly. Too sweetly. "Oh, absolutely." The Emperor's eyes narrowed. "You have always been reckless, my daughter. But even I did not foresee this." Ethan braced himself, expecting the worst. Then, the Emperor rose from his throne. "Very well," he declared. "By the sacred laws of our ancestors, this union shall stand." The hall erupted into chaos. Nobles began speaking, some shouting, over one another. Some called for his immediate execution, others demanded a trial, while a few merely smirked, already scheming how to use this turn of events to their advantage. Kale, standing rigid at the Emperor's right, looked like he was seconds away from launching Ethan into deep space. Ethan turned to Alinea, voice low. "This feels like a bad moment." Alinea only grinned. "Welcome to Zytharian politics, dear husband." Ethan groaned. That night, someone tried to kill Ethan again. This time, he was slightly more prepared. The moment he heard the faint click of a concealed weapon being primed, he dove sideways, narrowly avoiding a small, needle-thin projectile that embedded itself into his pillow and hissed with corrosive energy. "Oh, come on," Ethan shouted, rolling off the bed. A shadowed figure lunged at him from the balcony, blade gleaming in the dim light. Ethan had no weapons, no training, no plan. So, naturally, he grabbed the nearest object, a decorative fruit bowl, and hurled it. The assassin dodged effortlessly. Ethan had exactly 1 second to contemplate his impending doom before a violent energy pulse sent the intruder flying backward, crashing into the far wall. Alinea stood in the doorway, a compact energy pistol in one hand, a goblet of wine in the other. She looked entirely unbothered. "I leave you alone for one evening," she sighed. Ethan, still catching his breath, glared at her. "Oh, yeah, sure. Take your time. No rush or anything." Alinea took a slow sip of wine. "You weren't in immediate danger." Ethan gestured at the assassin, who was still smoking from the energy blast. "Excuse me?" Alinea smirked. "The palace would have handled it. It's rather protective of you." "Right. The sentient palace that had already saved his ass once." Ethan exhaled, rubbing his temples. "I need a drink." Alinea held out her goblet. Ethan sighed and took it. As he drank, Alinea leaned against the wall, watching him with something dangerously close to admiration. "You surprise me, Terran," she murmured. "Most in your position would have begged for a way out by now." Ethan lowered the goblet. "I'm still considering it." Alinea chuckled. "Then you should know something important." Ethan arched a brow. "Oh." Alinea's eyes glowed faintly. "The attempts on your life will not stop. Not until you prove yourself." Ethan swallowed hard. "Define prove?" Alinea's smirk was pure mischief and challenge. "By surviving." Ethan groaned. Of course. The next morning, Ethan found himself in a combat arena, specifically a Zytharian battle pit, an underground training ground where warriors fought with live weapons for sport and honor. Standing opposite him was Kale. Ethan, unarmed and woefully outmatched, felt a sinking realization. This, he muttered, is a terrible idea. Kale unsheathed a wicked, curved energy blade, his expression unreadable. You wish to survive this court, Terran? Ethan hesitated. I mean, ideally, yes. Kale tossed a wooden practice sword at his feet. Then fight. Ethan stared at the weapon, then at Kale, then back at the weapon. Alinya, watching from the sidelines, called out cheerfully, Try not to die, husband. Ethan sighed, picked up the sword, and muttered, I hate my life. Kale lunged, and Ethan's education in Zytharian survival truly began. Ethan barely had time to lift his pathetic excuse for a sword before Kale moved like a goddamn thunderstrike, closing the distance in a blur of motion. Step 1. Forget that your opponent is a highly trained warrior. Ethan instinctively threw himself backward, narrowly avoiding the first swipe of Kale's energy blade. It hummed through the air, slicing cleanly through the stone pillar behind him as though it were buttered paper. Ethan let out a strangled laugh. Oh, great, he gasped. This is fine. Everything is fine. Kale did not respond. Instead, he pivoted and came at him again, his movements impossibly precise. A predator toying with its kill. Step 2. Try to fight back and immediately regret it. Ethan swung wildly. Kale sidestepped effortlessly, snatched Ethan's wrist mid-strike, and twisted. Ethan hit the ground with a loud thud, his sword clattering uselessly beside him. From the sidelines, Alinya applauded. He lasted longer than I expected, she mused. Ethan groaned. Glad I could entertain. Kale loomed over him, displeased. You are slow, he stated. Ethan scowled. Well, yeah, I don't exactly spend my weekends training for Mortal Kombat. Kale narrowed his eyes. Then it is time you learned. Ethan had a bad feeling about that. Training under Prince Kale was less of a learning experience and more of a prolonged near-death event. For the next week, Ethan found himself subjected to a brutal daily regimen that included hand-to-hand combat with soldiers who did not believe in holding back, weapon drills using alien blades that hummed ominously when activated, dodging energy bolts fired at him for reflex training, a survival exercise where he was dropped into a labyrinth filled with carnivorous plants. That was not fun. By the end of it, he had 1,000 new bruises, a newfound respect for Zytharian warriors, and an even deeper hatred for mornings. But the real trouble started when he overheard a conversation he was never meant to hear. It happened by accident. Ethan had been sneaking out of a training session early because screw that noise when he passed by an ornate chamber guarded by 2 silent, armored figures. The door was slightly open. He heard voices inside. He is an anomaly, a mistake. The council will not allow this to stand. A deep, measured voice. Familiar. Kale. Another voice, lower, more conspiratorial. Someone else. The Emperor has declared the marriage valid, the second voice said. If we remove him now, it would be seen as treason. A pause. Then Kale spoke again, voice sharp. There are ways. Ethan's stomach dropped. He backed away slowly, heart pounding. Was Kale actively planning his assassination? Fantastic. That night, Ethan found himself pacing in his royal chambers, replaying Kale's words over and over. If Kale was plotting something, did Alinya know? Did she care? And more importantly, was Ethan about to wake up dead? His thoughts were interrupted when Alinya strolled in, draped in something dangerously sheer, her silver-blue skin glowing in the dim light. Ethan froze. Hi. Alinya tilted her head, watching him with lazy amusement. You look troubled, dear husband. Ethan exhaled. Oh, you know, just a casual case of, I think your brother wants me dead. Alinya arched a brow. Yes, well, he's hardly alone in that sentiment. Ethan shot her a look. Not helping. Alinya smirked, stepping closer. And yet, you still live. For now. She placed a hand against his chest, fingers cool. Do you trust me, Ethan? Ethan hesitated. He wanted to say no. He should have said no. But something in her eyes, something dangerous, something knowing, made him pause. Finally, he sighed. I don't know yet. Alinia's smile was enigmatic. Good. Keep it that way. Then, without another word, she slipped into bed, entirely unbothered by the political chaos surrounding them. Ethan, meanwhile, lay awake. Because if Cale really was plotting something, then Ethan needed a plan. Fast. The next morning, Ethan received a formal summons. A royal banquet, hosted by Cale. Ethan, holding the elaborate golden invitation, turned to Alinia. Tell me honestly, he said, is this a trap? Alinia sipped her morning tea. Oh, absolutely. Ethan groaned. Great. Alinia smiled. Don't worry, dear husband. I'll be there to watch. Watch me get poisoned? Her smirk was not reassuring. Perhaps. Ethan sighed. This marriage was going to kill him. Ethan Carter had walked into plenty of diplomatic minefields before, but none quite like this. The grand banquet hall of the Zytharian Palace was a towering chamber of obsidian and bioluminescent gold, its ceilings high enough to make even the tallest guests feel small and insignificant. Hundreds of alien nobles, politicians, warlords, aristocrats, milled about, dressed in the shimmering silks and armored finery of their respective houses. At the head of the massive feast table, Prince Cale sat like a king who hadn't yet taken his throne. And at Cale's right-hand side, Ethan's seat. Oh, this was bad. Alinia, perfectly composed, slid her arm through his, smiling up at him. Relax, husband, she purred. Try not to look so edible. Ethan shot her a flat look. You do realize I have, at minimum, a 60% chance of dying tonight, right? Alinia hummed thoughtfully. I'd say 40%. Oh, well, wait, that's still terrible. True. Before he could respond, a gong sounded, and the hall fell into a hushed, expectant silence. Cale rose from his seat, expression unreadable. Honored guests, Cale intoned, his voice smooth, practiced, dangerous. Tonight, we celebrate a most unexpected union. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some nobles chuckled, others sneered. Ethan clenched his jaw. Great. Just fantastic. Cale gestured toward him, his golden eyes glinting. And so, let us properly welcome the newest member of our empire, Prince Consort Ethan Carter. Silence. Then, scattered applause, slow, polite, but cold. Ethan nodded stiffly. Thanks. Cale smirked. Come sit. Enjoy our hospitality. Ethan absolutely did not want to sit next to Cale, but refusing would be even dumber than actually showing up. So, with only a mild sense of impending doom, he took his seat. The banquet began, and that's when things got weird. Zytharian cuisine was equal parts mesmerizing and deeply concerning. Dishes of hovering, luminescent fruit pulsed faintly with bioenergy. Translucent seafood-like creatures twitched on platters, apparently still alive. A pitch-black liquid was poured into goblets, the fumes alone making Ethan's sinuses tingle. And then there was the meat, a towering roast, its flesh shifting color as though still in motion. Ethan leaned toward Alinia. What exactly am I looking at? Alinia tore off a piece and bit into it without hesitation. The feast beast, she said, chewing delicately. It adapts to the consumer's genetic profile. The flavor, texture, even the nutrient balance shifts to suit your biology. Ethan's stomach turned. So, it's alive? For now. Great. He was so screwed. And then came the first real test of the night. A servant approached, bowing low. In his hands, a small, crystalline cup filled with deep purple liquid. An offering from the crown prince, the servant announced. Ethan stilled. Across the table, Cale was watching him, waiting. Alinia, unbothered, delicately swirled her own goblet. Oh, how thoughtful. Ethan frowned. There were only two reasons to hand someone a drink at a royal banquet. It was an honor, an extension of goodwill. It was a test. Or, worse. 3. It was poisoned. Ethan sighed. If I don't drink this, I'm insulting Kale, right? Alinia smiled sweetly. Yes. And if I do drink it, there's a solid chance I die? Also yes. Awesome. The entire banquet hall was watching him now. Kale arched a brow, voice smooth. What's wrong, Prince Consort? Terran constitution too fragile for our hospitality? Ethan gritted his teeth. Damn it. He lifted the cup and drank. The liquid burned, but not painfully. It was a slow, creeping warmth spreading through his limbs. His vision sharpened, his pulse pounded, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he was very aware of every sound, every breath, every heartbeat in the room. Kale's smirk widened. Oh, he mused. He doesn't collapse. Interesting. Ethan set the cup down hard, exhaling. That was an experience. Kale leaned back. Most off-worlders wouldn't survive that. Ethan exhaled sharply. Neat. Glad I'm not most off-worlders. A beat. Then, Kale laughed. Low, amused. And yet, something about it wasn't comforting at all. Ethan's stomach twisted. This wasn't over. By the time the feast wound down, Ethan was thoroughly exhausted. His nerves frayed from the political tightrope walking masquerading as dinner. Then Kale rose from his seat again. One last tradition, Kale announced, gesturing toward Ethan. Oh no. The prince consort must prove himself in a rite of strength. Ethan's blood ran cold. Alinia, for once, frowned slightly. Kale's smirk didn't waver. What kind of husband would he be if he could not defend his own wife? A wave of approval rippled through the hall. Ethan wanted to die. Kale turned back to him. Choose your weapon. This was it. A public challenge. A no-win scenario. If Ethan refused? Weak. An embarrassment. If he lost? Humiliated. Possibly dead. If he won? Well, that wasn't happening. Ethan clenched his fists. Then, with no other choice, he stepped forward. I'll fight, he said. A satisfied murmur spread through the crowd. Kale grinned. Excellent. Ethan exhaled. Okay. Think. Survive. Alinia watched him with unreadable eyes. And somewhere, deep down, Ethan knew, one way or another, after tonight, everything was going to change. Ethan Carter had made plenty of bad choices in his life, but agreeing to this duel was rapidly climbing the ranks of top 5 dumbest decisions ever. The entire banquet hall emptied into the Imperial Combat Pit, an arena carved from black obsidian and glowing veins of molten energy deep beneath the palace. Towering columns of crackling plasma encased the perimeter, casting long, flickering shadows. Thousands of Zytharian nobles, warlords, and off-world dignitaries gathered in the stands above, eager for blood. And Ethan? Ethan was about to get his ass kicked in front of the whole empire. Kale stood across from him, calm, composed, and utterly terrifying. The crown prince had changed into light battle armor, elegant, form-fitting, and very much designed to kill things efficiently. In contrast, Ethan wore his formal banquet clothes. Because, of course, no one had given him time to change. This is a bad idea, Ethan muttered under his breath. Alinia, standing beside him, smirked. Most of your ideas are bad. At least this one is entertaining. Ethan scowled. Again, not helping. Alinia leaned in slightly, voice lower. You don't have to win, you know. You just have to survive. Ethan exhaled sharply. Great, because that's so much easier. A tall Zytharian battle marshal stepped forward, holding an ornate weapon rack. By ancient custom, the challenger selects first, the marshal declared, gesturing toward Ethan. Ethan stared at the collection of absolutely terrifying alien weapons, each one humming with deadly energy. His options included a twin-bladed plasma glaive, a wickedly curved energy sword that pulsed with shifting colors, a set of serrated daggers vibrating at a frequency that suggested cuts through bone like butter, a spear that crackled with electricity, a standard, old-fashioned combat knife. Ethan reached for the spear, only for Alinia to subtly grab his wrist before he could touch it. He glanced at her. She shook her head, just barely. Ethan hesitated, then grabbed the dagger set instead. Kale's lips curled in amusement. He stepped forward, without hesitation, and selected the energy sword. Of course, Ethan was so screwed. The arena fell into a thick, expectant silence. The battle gong struck, and Kale attacked. He moved like a viper, fast, precise, merciless. Ethan barely had time to dodge the first strike, twisting aside just as Kale's blade sliced through empty air where his head had been. The sheer force of it sent heat washing over Ethan's skin. Too fast, too strong. Ethan had trained with Kale for a week, but this was Kale unleashed. A brutal, surgical storm of flashes and slashes, his blade singing through the air in a deadly arc. Ethan blocked, barely, his daggers scraping against the vibrating plasma edge, sending a sharp, burning jolt up his arm. Kale didn't stop. He pressed forward. Ethan knew exactly what was happening. Kale was testing him, hunting for weaknesses. The problem? Ethan was made entirely of weaknesses. Kale faked a downward slash, then reversed direction at the last second. Ethan realized the feint too late. The blade sliced across his ribs. Pain exploded through his side. He stumbled back, gasping, feeling warm blood spreading across his tunic. Kale didn't stop. He pressed the attack, forcing Ethan toward the edge of the arena, toward the crackling energy barrier. One step too far back, and Ethan would be incinerated. The crowd roared in approval. They could smell blood, smell the kill. Ethan wasn't going to make it. Unless he played dirty. Ethan faked a stumble. Kale, expecting an easy kill, lunged forward, and Ethan threw a handful of dirt into his face. The distraction lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Ethan dropped low, swept Kale's legs out from under him, and drove one of his daggers straight into Kale's shoulder. The blade bit deep. Kale snarled in pain. The crowd gasped, and just like that, Ethan was still in the fight. Kale recovered fast. Too fast. He yanked the dagger out, unfazed, his golden eyes burning with murderous intent. "You fight like a coward," Kale growled. Ethan, panting, bleeding, and very much not having a good time, managed a weak grin. "Yeah, well," he wheezed. "I'm not the one who picked this fight." Kale's fury sharpened. He lunged. Ethan rolled aside, narrowly avoiding the plasma blade aimed directly at his throat. He needed a way out fast. His eyes flicked to the energy barrier. An idea struck. It was a terrible idea, but it was also his only chance. Ethan lured Kale toward the edge, pretending to stumble again, inviting the kill. Kale took the bait. He swung. A full, powerful strike aimed to end the fight. And Ethan? Ethan dodged at the very last second. Kale's own momentum betrayed him. His sword clipped the energy barrier. A violent pulse of crackling plasma energy surged through the blade, jolting up Kale's arm with a brutal shockwave. The Crown Prince snarled, staggering back. Not injured, but stunned. This was it. Ethan moved, fast, slamming the hilt of his dagger into Kale's temple. Kale's eyes flickered, and for the first time, he hit the ground. The entire arena went silent. Ethan, bleeding, shaking, exhausted, stared down at Kale's unconscious form. The realization hit him all at once. He had won. Holy shit, he had actually won. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, Alinya started clapping. Slow, deliberate. The crowd erupted. Some were cheering. Some were furious. Others? Laughing, delighted by the unexpected outcome. The battle marshal stepped forward. Prince Consort Ethan Carter is victorious. Kale, still dazed, blinked up at him. And for the first time, Ethan saw something new in his eyes. Not hatred, not rage, but something dangerously close to respect. The Zytharian nobility had seen many battles, duels between warriors, blood feuds between houses, brutal conflicts that spanned entire solar systems. But never before had they witnessed a Terran diplomat defeat the Crown Prince in single combat. The shock still rippled through the crowd, even as Ethan stood panting, bloodied, but alive, staring down at Kale's dazed form. Then, the Emperor rose. A wave of silence rippled through the arena, the murmurs of the court dying instantly as the supreme ruler of the Zytharian Empire stepped forward. His golden imperial robe shimmered, the bioluminescent markings across his skin shifting like stardust caught in motion. He studied Ethan for a long, unreadable moment, and then he laughed. A deep, rumbling sound that filled the chamber, shaking through the walls, making the assembled nobles stiffen in shock. "Well," Emperor Vadres mused, his piercing violet eyes locking onto Ethan's battered form, "it seems my daughter has chosen well." Ethan, who was seconds away from collapsing, managed a weak chuckle. Thanks." The Emperor's amusement didn't waver. "You were never meant to survive this, Terran, but you did." Kale, still on the ground, let out a harsh breath before finally pushing himself up. "I yield," he said, voice tight but even. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Kale Zytharian, the future Emperor, had never yielded before. And now, he was yielding to a human. Ethan had no idea what this meant, but from the way Alinea was smirking with immense satisfaction, he was starting to realize that he had just rewritten the political landscape of an entire empire. Ethan's victory changed everything. Almost overnight, he went from an amusing outsider to a legitimate force in the royal court. Nobles who had mocked him now offered strategic alliances. Generals debated whether his presence in the empire could serve as a bridge to the Terran Republic. Assassination attempts continued, but they were less frequent. Not because they wanted him alive, but because now, he was too politically important to remove easily. And then there was Kale. His former would-be executioner now regarded him with something new. Not quite hatred, not quite acceptance, something in between. "You embarrassed me," Kale said one evening, his voice as sharp as his blade. Ethan smirked. "Hey, you're the one who challenged me." Kale exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "You may not be as weak as I believed." "Wow, that's almost a compliment." Kale's gaze darkened. "Do not mistake my respect for friendship, Terran." Ethan shrugged. "Oh, trust me, I never do." But even as Kale said it, Ethan couldn't help but notice. Something had shifted between them, and that shift would change the fate of the Empire itself. 1 month after Ethan's duel, everything fell apart. A Zytharian outpost along the Imperial border was attacked. The Solari Dominion, a rival alien faction, had invaded Imperial space. It was war, and Ethan was now right in the middle of it. The war escalated faster than anyone expected. Entire star systems burned. The Imperial Council fractured. Some believed the Terran Republic should be pulled into the war as allies. Others wanted to eradicate all off-world influence, including Ethan himself. The Emperor called for a war council. Ethan, Kale, and Alinea stood at the heart of it all. "This war will decide the future of our empire," the Emperor stated. "And you, Prince Consort, are now part of that future." Ethan exhaled. This was no longer about his accidental marriage, no longer about diplomatic survival. This was about war. And now, Ethan had a choice. Standing on the Imperial War Bridge, Ethan gazed out at the vast armada of Zytharian warships, their crimson hulls gleaming in the void. Alinea stood beside him, watching with unreadable eyes. "You could leave," she murmured. "Return to your Terran Republic. They would take you back now." Ethan was silent. He could. He had fought to survive this empire. He had proven himself, but somewhere along the way, he had become part of it. He glanced at Kale, who stood across the command deck, giving battle orders with fierce precision. Once an enemy, now something else. And Alinea, his wife, his greatest ally, and his greatest danger. She tilted her head, watching him, waiting. "So," she murmured, "will you fight for us?" Ethan took a slow breath, and then he made his choice. History would remember him by many names. The Terran Prince, the Outworld Consort, the one who changed the Zytharian Empire forever. But for Ethan Carter, it all came down to one thing. One dance, one mistake, and a future he never could have imagined.